In the cold silence of sealed archives, there exist files that were never meant to be read. Reports stamped with black ink warnings. Restricted, top secret, ultra. They are fragments of a history the public was never supposed to inherit. Fragments buried beneath official communiques and sanitized accounts of World War II. Within these hidden documents, the war does not end with parades and liberation. Instead, it lingers in dim corridors, in shadowed negotiations, in bodies buried far from marked graves. Each page carries the weight of human silence, names erased or traded like commodities, as if lives could be exchanged for blueprints, or treaties inked in blood could remain unseen by daylight. The wars we think we know, of Normandy's beaches, Stalingrad's ruins, or Hiroshima's fire, mask another kind of conflict, waged not only with armies but with betrayals, secret pacts, and compromises written in disappearing ink. Intelligence agencies hunted more than enemies. They hunted truths too dangerous for allies to discover. Behind every proclamation of victory was a ledger of sins carefully concealed. When one reads the fragments, when one pieces together the margins and blacked out lines, a darker picture emerges. Scientists who should have stood trial instead flown to new homelands. Treaties signed not for peace but for extermination. Weapons tested not abroad but on native soil. These stories, sealed for decades under the justification of national survival, now whisper with the weight of voices long silenced, waiting to be heard in their entirety. Chapter 1. Shadows of Operation. Paperclip's origin in the dim recesses of the National Archives. Box number 3472 carries a label nearly unreadable from decades of wear. Operation Paperclip, early drafts. Inside, the folders are brittle, their edges curled, and many of the pages stamped with a faded OSS eyes only. What emerges from these fragile records is a story darker than the celebrated post-war narrative of American scientific triumph. It is the tale of how, while the world still burned in 1943, the United States was already negotiating with the architects of Germany's most terrifying weapons. Far from being a post-war act of pragmatism, Operation Paperclip had its genesis in shadows cast long before Berlin crumbled. The paper trail begins in November 1943, when an OSS memorandum, marked Directive West 47, references a clandestine meeting near Lisbon. Present were 2 American intelligence officers under diplomatic cover and a courier connected to the SS Research Command at Peenemünde. The documents reveal coded language, items of extreme technical urgency, human material, and priority to propulsion sciences. Cross-referencing with Gestapo File No. 17, recovered from the ruins of Magdeburg, indicates that these negotiations centered on V2 rocket blueprints, propulsion data, and the work of men like Werner von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, and Walter Dornberger. At the very moment Allied aircrews were being cut down over Europe, officials in Washington were calculating the value of their killers' minds. The backdrop to these negotiations was not diplomacy, but brutality. Dora Mittelbau, the underground factory where V2 rockets were assembled, was built on the bones of slave labor. Between 1943 and 1945, more than 20,000 prisoners perished in the tunnels, their bodies consumed by starvation, disease, and deliberate neglect. Camp reports discovered in Soviet archives describe conditions where prisoners were forced to drag rocket casings by hand through the stifling darkness, their sweat dripping onto the very weapons later celebrated as marvels of engineering. Von Braun himself, in testimony secretly recorded by Allied interrogators at Dustbin Camp in Versailles, admitted visiting Dora at least a dozen times, watching men collapse under loads of steel, noting but never intervening. This was the human price behind the technical urgency. Yet even as reports of Dora's horrors filtered westward, the calculus shifted. The files describe urgent communiques in March 1944, when Allied bombings threatened to destroy the research centers at Peenemünde. Operation Overcast, the codename that would later evolve into Paperclip, was greenlit. OSS Director William Donovan authorized contacts with intermediaries in neutral Switzerland, allowing German scientists to pass coded messages offering collaboration. These documents, marked with reference numbers such as XL1843, were deliberately withheld from the War Department, routed instead through a circle of intelligence officers who understood the political risks. Publicly, Roosevelt and Churchill swore to punish the architects of Nazi terror. Privately, the scientists were already being written into America's post-war plans. The Soviets knew. NKVD reports from Smolensk declassified in 1992, detail intercepted transmissions between SS engineers and Western handlers. The documents were filed under Operation Fakkel, and they described frantic Soviet efforts to capture rocket personnel before they could defect. Stalin's agents understood that the rockets were not simply weapons of the past, but instruments of future power. When Red Army units reached Nordhausen in April 1945, they discovered the tunnels of Dora still lined with unfinished V2s. Soviet engineers crated and shipped what they could, but many of the key mines had already disappeared, spirited away through corridors marked not by surrender, but by secret transport orders issued under the seal of the US Army. The sanitized post-war narrative speaks of rehabilitated scientists, men who shed their uniforms and pledged allegiance to new masters. But the files reveal a darker continuity. Von Braun's unit, redesignated as Specialist Team 1150, was flown first to Fort Bliss, Texas, and later to Huntsville, Alabama. Their records were laundered, SS membership struck from files, complicity with slave labor omitted. One memorandum, signed by Colonel Donald Putt in 1946, notes bluntly, "Records must be adjusted. Association with war crimes would jeopardize strategic value." Even Arthur Rudolph, later heralded as the manager of NASA's Saturn V project, was directly responsible for production quotas at Dora. His 1943 factory reports, recovered from German archives, list Durchschnittliche Sterblichkeit, 250 per week, average mortality. Yet he too was shielded, granted citizenship, and celebrated until whispers of his past forced his quiet denaturalization decades later. For decades, these stories were hidden under the protective cloak of national security. Journalists who inquired were stonewalled, their requests denied on grounds of sensitive Cold War intelligence. But inside the declassified pages lies a disturbing realization. America's leap into the space age was not born in innocence. The Apollo rockets that carried men to the moon were direct descendants of weapons conceived in underground tunnels soaked with death. The laboratories of Fort Detrick and Redstone Arsenal were enriched with data extracted not in sterile experiments, but in forced labor camps where human lives were measured against production charts. The voices of the dead linger in the margins. In a testimony recorded by the US Army's Judge Advocate General, prisoner Karol Stibor, a Czech resistance fighter, described conditions inside Dora. The men worked 12 hours, sometimes more, without food. The air was poison. Those who fell were not helped. They were dragged aside, and the rockets continued. His words never entered the Nuremberg record, excised from official transcripts, filed instead under supplementary testimony, restricted. To admit them would have risked exposing the bargain that had already been struck. The Soviet archives echo similar silences. Files from 1946 describe interrogations of captured German engineers who spoke bitterly of colleagues vanishing into American custody. One NKVD officer wrote, "We interrogate corpses, while the Americans caught the executioners." Stalin himself reportedly raged, accusing his Western allies of treachery, yet he too would shelter German specialists under Operation Osowa-Vyakim, relocating thousands to Soviet research centers near Moscow and Kazan. In this grim symmetry, the victors mirrored one another. Atrocities overlooked, expertise coveted, justice postponed indefinitely. As the Cold War hardened, the narrative was cemented. Schoolchildren learned that the space race was a triumph of freedom over tyranny. The rocket a symbol of human ingenuity. Few were told that the rocket's first true launch site was not Cape Canaveral, but the hollowed mountains of Nordhausen, where prisoners collapsed under chains. Few were told that the contracts signed in Huntsville were simply the continuation of bargains made in Lisbon cafes, where men weighed blueprints against blood. Operation Paperclip became not an afterthought of war, but a cornerstone of power, its origins deliberately obscured. The truth remains etched in the archival fragments. Operation Paperclip was not a rescue of knowledge from the ruins. It was a transaction conceived while bombs still fell, a cold calculation that judged the future more important than justice. Its legacy is written not only in the stars above, but in the silence of tunnels where the cost of progress was measured in corpses, their names forgotten, their suffering excised from the history books. And the files, now brittle and yellowing, whisper the truth the world was never meant to learn, that victory was compromised long before the war was won. Chapter 2. The Secret Pact of Brest-Litovsk. Reborn among the dust of Soviet-era vaults in Moscow, a folder stamped Directive Severe 12 carries the faint scent of mildew and ink, a relic of a past deliberately suppressed. The date on the cover reads September 1940, a year after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had stunned the world with its cynical division of Poland. Official histories describe that pact as nothing more than a pragmatic arrangement between two ideologically opposed giants. Yet inside this folder lies evidence of something darker, a hidden continuation, a clandestine resurrection of the Brest-Litovsk spirit, where enemies of the future briefly became accomplices in silence and blood. The documents suggest that beyond the infamous public clauses of non-aggression and territorial division, there existed an unacknowledged addendum drafted in the ruins of the old fortress city of Brest, echoing the site where Soviet Russia had once signed away its lands to Imperial Germany in 1918. This was Brest-Litovsk reborn, not for peace, but for extermination. The secret pact emerges through scattered fragments. Soviet field reports from September 1940 refer to joint coordination efforts along the Polish borderlands, codenamed Severe 12. NKVD archives describe operational exchanges with Gestapo counterparts, where partisan leaders captured in Byelorussia or Galicia were redirected across the boundary for liquidation. One chilling memo, stamped with the signature of NKVD chief Lavrenti Beria, records the transfer of 37 captured resistance figures to Gestapo custody at Białystok, with a note stating, "They will serve as a demonstration for their comrades." In return, the Germans handed over Polish communists and underground cells sympathetic to Moscow, men and women who were soon dispatched to the gulags of Vorkuta or Kolyma, their names vanishing into frozen ledgers. What emerges is a portrait of mutual convenience, two sworn enemies momentarily united in suppressing the very movements that might have resisted them both. Evidence of these joint operations filtered westward, but was quickly buried. British decrypts under the Ultra program, filed as Ultra Black 1742, intercepted fragments of communications between Gestapo, command in Krakow, and NKVD counterparts in Minsk. The decrypts spoke of interchange of persons and border clearance of undesirable elements. When these files reached Churchill's War Cabinet, their implications were deemed too dangerous to expose. Public disclosure would have shattered the fragile alliance with Stalin, potentially unraveling the tenuous cooperation needed to defeat Hitler. Thus, the reports were sealed, stamped secret until 1985, and filed under not for release. Even now, many of the names remain redacted, their fates known only to the silence of archival ink. The setting of Brest itself carried heavy symbolism. In the damp basements of the Brest fortress, a location still scarred from the earlier Polish-Soviet battles of 1919 to 1920, delegations of NKVD officers and Gestapo officials allegedly met in late 1939 and early 1940. Surviving German memoranda reference, conferences in Brest under the codename Treffenpunkt Blau. Here, discussions were held about border policing, intelligence sharing, and the systematic destruction of resistance. While the official Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had been signed in the grandeur of Moscow, its darker offspring was sealed in these underground chambers, lit only by dim lamps, guarded by soldiers who later swore to silence. The Soviets agreed to suppress nationalist movements hostile to German occupation, while the Gestapo pledged to neutralize communist cells. The result was a coordinated effort to eliminate all forms of opposition, ensuring the occupied Polish lands remained carved, subdued, and silent. The consequences were immediate. Resistance leaders across occupied Poland vanished, their networks collapsing under dual assault. Reports from the Polish underground, preserved in the London archives of the Polish government in exile, detail strange patterns, fighters arrested by the Gestapo reappearing months later in Soviet prisons, or vice versa. One testimony, smuggled through Sweden in 1942, describes a resistance courier named Jan Kowalski, who was captured near Grodno. Initially held by German authorities, he was later seen in the NKVD's Brigidki prison in Lwów. Weeks after, he disappeared entirely, his trail vanishing into the Siberian expanse. His story, multiplied thousands of times, testifies to the existence of the hidden pact, where borders did not separate enemies, but connected collaborators. Churchill himself acknowledged the whispers in private. A memo from his personal secretary, dated December 1941, summarizes a conversation in which Churchill remarked, "The Russians have ghosts to conceal. They have bartered with the devil as much as Hitler. Yet the war effort required silence. Britain needed Moscow, and Moscow's sins could not be spoken while German divisions marched east. Thus, the truth was entombed in classified drawers, while the world was told of a grand alliance of liberty and survival. Inside Soviet archives, uncovered after 1991, the brutality of these exchanges is recorded with chilling bureaucratic precision. A document from February 1940, signed by Beria and marked Execution List 242, outlines the transfer of captured Polish officers to German custody in exchange for suspected communists. Among the names later discovered were men tied to the Katyn massacre, where 22,000 Polish officers and intellectuals were shot in the back of the head by the NKVD. For decades, Moscow denied responsibility, blaming the Germans. Yet fragments suggest a darker truth. While Katyn was a Soviet crime, its concealment was facilitated by German cooperation, with the understanding that silence over Katyn would be repaid by silence over German executions of communist partisans. Thus, a grim symmetry bound the two regimes. The human cost was staggering. In Vilnius, underground archives uncovered in 1944 revealed diaries of resistance fighters describing the sense of betrayal as comrades disappeared into the machinery of both occupiers. "We fought two monsters," one entry reads. "They spoke different tongues, but their boots pressed upon the same throat." For the fighters in the forests of Poland and Byelorussia, the supposed ideological gulf between Nazism and communism meant little. Both powers hunted them with equal fervor, trading names and faces as if they were currency in a clandestine market of death. What makes the hidden Pact of Brest-Litovsk Reborn so chilling is not only its existence, but its erasure. Neither Moscow nor Berlin ever admitted to its clauses. At Nuremberg, Soviet prosecutors presented themselves as righteous avengers of fascism, omitting their own collaboration. The Western Allies, aware through ultra-decrypts of at least fragments of the pact, suppressed their knowledge, unwilling to fracture the unity of victory. The files remained dormant, their revelations too dangerous to the narratives of liberation. Only after the Cold War's end did fragments emerge, pulled from Russian vaults by historians, combing through crates of yellowing paper. Yet even today, much remains concealed. In both Russian and German archives, key files are missing, their catalogue entries marked simply as withdrawn. It is whispered among researchers that these files were deliberately destroyed in the late 1940s, when both superpowers sought to erase traces of their earlier complicity. The silence continues, maintained not by necessity of war, but by fear of exposing the uncomfortable truth that beneath the banners of ideology and war, expedience ruled. The Soviets and the Nazis, mortal enemies on the battlefield, shared a hidden season of partnership where blood was currency and resistance was the common enemy. This, then, is the forbidden face of Brest-Litovsk Reborn. Not a treaty of peace, but a conspiracy of extermination. Not a pact of nations, but a pact of shadows, written in the lives of countless resistance fighters who vanished between two regimes. Their voices echo faintly in the archives, in scattered memos, in diaries smuggled through borders, in whispers carried across frozen camps. To uncover them is to glimpse a history deliberately excised from the story of World War II, and to acknowledge them is to admit that victory was built not only on sacrifice, but on silence, on pacts erased, on truths locked away in the darkness of sealed files. Chapter 3: Britain's Hidden Civilian Bombing Trials. On a damp morning in the Welsh countryside, mist clung to the valleys and stone cottages as villagers were ordered from their homes, their belongings hastily loaded onto lorries under the supervision of uniformed men who offered no explanation beyond the phrase strategic relocation. The year was 1941, and Britain stood bloodied but defiant, still reeling from the blitz that had scorched London and Coventry. To the displaced, the government's assurances sounded like protection, but the documents unearthed decades later in the Air Ministry's archives tell a different story. The evacuation was not about safety, it was about secrecy. Under the codename Project Daggerfall, Britain had begun testing large-scale incendiary raids on its own soil, sacrificing remote communities to perfect the firestorms that would later engulf German cities. These were not accidents of war, they were rehearsals. The files, once sealed under the Official Secrets Act, reveal that the Air Ministry identified several locations: a scattering of villages in rural Wales, sections of the Scottish Isles, and even coastal hamlets in Cornwall. Chosen for their isolation and sparse populations, these areas became unwitting laboratories for a new kind of warfare. Reports dated May 1941 describe controlled incendiary dispersal tests conducted by RAF Bomber Command, with magnesium and phosphorus canisters dropped from low altitude onto abandoned cottages and farmland. To outside observers, the blackened ruins might have resembled the aftermath of a German raid. In truth, the destruction was deliberate, measured, and meticulously documented by men in uniform holding clipboards and stopwatches. Every blaze was timed, every collapse of timber beams recorded, every animal carcass examined for patterns of fire penetration. Among the most disturbing documents are handwritten field notes attributed to officers of RAF Squadron 617, the same squadron that would later earn fame as the Dam Busters. These notes, marked restricted, training only, describe trials in which barns filled with livestock were ignited using experimental incendiary devices. The purpose was not cruelty for its own sake, but precision, to calculate how long it took for the fire to consume, how heat spread across living bodies, how quickly flames could leap from one structure to another under variable wind conditions. One note chillingly records average time to ignition, 45 seconds. Total structural collapse, 11 minutes. The cold detachment of scientific inquiry masks the horror of what those numbers represent. Lives, reduced to data points in a grim rehearsal for industrial-scale destruction. The choice of locations was no accident. Wales and Scotland were distant from prying journalists, and entire valleys could be sealed off under military pretext. Residents who protested were given compensation in the form of ration books or vague promises of post-war return. Few ever saw their homes again. Photographs taken by Ministry of Information personnel, never released to the public, show rows of gutted stone houses, their walls collapsed inward, smoke still curling from the ruins. Some images bear an uncanny resemblance to later photographs of Hamburg in 1943 or Dresden in 1945. The continuity is unmistakable. The patterns of destruction tested in Britain's own backyards were replicated on a continental scale. Churchill's War Cabinet was fully aware of these trials. Cabinet Office papers marked Most Secret 1941-42 contained discussions on the moral risk of conducting experiments on civilian structures. Yet the argument that prevailed was ruthless. The survival of the nation required total war, and total war demanded mastery of the firestorm. Professor Frederick Lindemann, Churchill's chief scientific advisor, argued strongly for the continuation of trials. In a memorandum preserved in the Churchill papers, he wrote, "Urban centers are the lungs of the enemy. Their destruction will suffocate resistance. Precision is essential, and precision requires experiment." His words became doctrine, justifying the use of entire landscapes as testing grounds. The secrecy was maintained by layers of deception. Official records listed bombed villages as victims of accidental jettison or practice munitions failures. Locals were discouraged from speaking, threatened with prosecution under the Official Secrets Act if they questioned the relocations. In one case, a schoolteacher from a Welsh village attempted to write to her MP describing the destruction she had witnessed. Her letter was intercepted by censors, and she was quietly reassigned to a different county, her village erased from official maps. The machinery of silence was as efficient as the machinery of destruction. When the bombing campaigns reached their height over Germany, the connection became undeniable. Dresden's Inferno in February 1945 mirrored the patterns logged in Welsh valleys 4 years earlier. Hamburg's firestorm in 1943 bore the signature of techniques tested on Scottish Isles. The carefully calculated spread of phosphorus, the timing of wave attacks to maximize airflow, the staggering heat designed to consume oxygen, all had their origins not in German skies, but in Britain's hidden experiments. And yet, the British public was told only of German atrocities, never of the trials conducted in their own name. After the war, as the world grappled with the morality of strategic bombing, the truth remained buried. The Nuremberg trials did not address the deliberate targeting of civilians by Allied forces. Histories written in the immediate post-war years praised the bravery of Bomber Command, while omitting the evidence of secret domestic trials. Only with the partial release of Air Ministry records in the late 1970s did fragments surface. Researchers uncovered files labeled Daggerfall, their contents heavily redacted, pages missing or replaced with blank sheets stamped withdrawn. The revelations were too explosive, threatening to tarnish the myth of Britain as a purely defensive victim of German aggression. In the late 1990s, testimonies from elderly villagers added flesh to the skeletal archival record. Survivors spoke of being herded into buses, told only that their homes were needed for the war effort. Some recalled watching from distant hills as their villages went up in flames, bombs whistling down not from enemy aircraft but from their own. One man, then a boy, remembered his father pointing silently to the sky as RAF bombers passed overhead, releasing not practice dummies, but fire. His village never reappeared on post-war maps, swallowed into forestry projects and military training zones. The silence of decades was broken only by these whispered recollections, fragments of truth long buried beneath patriotic narrative. The legacy of these trials is profound. The RAF perfected the science of firebombing not in foreign cities, but in the secluded corners of its own kingdom. The destruction of Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden was not improvised retaliation, but the calculated application of methods refined in secret at home. The price of victory, then, was not only the incineration of enemy civilians, but the betrayal of Britain's own. Families displaced, landscapes scarred, histories erased, all sacrificed to the altar of strategic necessity. The files close with an eerie sense of finality. The last Daggerfall memorandum, dated March 1944, states simply, "Techniques sufficiently proven. Further domestic operations unnecessary." Within months, these techniques would be unleashed upon the Reich with merciless efficiency. Britain's hidden villages had served their purpose. Their ruins remained unmarked, their names erased, their stories silenced for generations. And in the echo of those silences lies the chilling truth, that even before the world burned in Hamburg and Dresden, the flames had already been tested, fanned, and measured on Britain's own soil in places now forgotten, buried beneath the official story of wartime endurance. Chapter 4. Tokyo's Forgotten Biological Weapons Exchange. The documents lie buried in the archives of the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, stamped with the words Declassified 1993 in bold red ink. Their pages are yellow, brittle, and stained by time, but their contents remain toxic. They reveal a transaction struck in the aftermath of Japan's surrender, a transaction that never appeared in the grand narratives of justice at Nuremberg or Tokyo. It was not the trial of men who had orchestrated atrocities, but the concealment of their crimes. Hidden under the codename Project Cherry Blossoms, American intelligence quietly granted immunity to the architects of Japan's biological warfare program, Unit 731, in exchange for their grisly research. While Nazi doctors faced judgment before the world, the men who unleashed plague, anthrax, and cholera upon helpless civilians in Manchuria disappeared into silence. Their files shipped not to courtrooms, but to laboratories in Maryland. The roots of this betrayal stretch back to the final year of the war. In Harbin, Manchuria, General Shiro Ishii presided over Unit 731, a sprawling complex disguised as a water purification facility. Behind its gates, thousands of prisoners, Chinese peasants, Soviet captives, Korean laborers, even Allied POWs, were subjected to experiments designed to perfect the weapons of plague. Victims were exposed to frostbite, vivisected without anesthesia, injected with pathogens, and dissected alive. Testimony gathered after the war by Soviet interrogators describes entire villages in Zhejiang province wiped out by deliberate plague infestations, their wells poisoned, their crops dusted with flea-borne pathogens released from ceramic bombs. The death toll remains uncertain. Tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, but the cruelty is undisputed. Yet, when the Japanese Empire crumbled in 1945, the men responsible should have stood trial alongside their German counterparts. Instead, they became assets. The declassified SCAP memoranda show the transaction unfolding in cold, bureaucratic language. A document dated May 6, 1947, addressed to General Douglas MacArthur, notes, "Information from Ishii deemed of extreme strategic value. Recommend immunity in exchange for full disclosure of data on human experimentation." Another memorandum, signed by Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders, confirms, "Data obtained exceeds all known Allied research in biological warfare. Subjects include plague vectors, anthrax dispersal, cholera transmission. Immunity advised." Nowhere do the documents mention justice, morality, or the suffering of victims. The calculus was simple. In the emerging Cold War, knowledge was power, and the atrocities of yesterday became the weapons of tomorrow. The Soviets protested bitterly. During the Khabarovsk war crimes trials of 1949, Soviet prosecutors presented chilling testimony from captured Japanese officers, describing the horrors of Unit 731. Witnesses spoke of plague bombs tested on living villagers, of frostbite chambers where prisoners' limbs were shattered with sticks after freezing, of vivisections conducted with clinical detachment. Yet Western observers dismissed the trials as propaganda, in part because the United States had already secured its own deal with Ishii and his subordinates. By labeling the Soviet revelations fabrications, American officials protected not only their strategic advantage, but also the men who had committed crimes rivaling those of Auschwitz and Dachau. Among the most damning evidence is a letter from General Charles Willoughby, MacArthur's intelligence chief, describing Ishii as indispensable. The letter, preserved in SCAP File 331, states, "His cooperation ensures exclusive access to data the Soviets must not obtain. Immunity, though distasteful, secures long-term strategic superiority." And so, Ishii was never tried. He lived quietly in Japan, rumored to have been consulted by American military researchers into the 1950s. Other Unit 731 officers went on to hold prominent positions in post-war Japan, some in academia, others in government, their pasts scrubbed clean by occupation authorities eager to maintain stability. The victims, meanwhile, were erased from history. The documents also reveal that the data obtained from Unit 731 did not sit idle. At Fort Detrick, Maryland, the center of America's biological warfare program, Japanese research was integrated into US experiments. Files labeled Cherry Blossoms Annex describe tests conducted on animal subjects using methodologies derived directly from Ishii's records. Though publicly, the United States renounced biological warfare, in secret, it pursued the very knowledge purchased with immunity. Survivors of Unit 731, many still suffering from the after effects of disease, were never acknowledged. Their suffering buried beneath the iron curtain of classified research. The concealment extended beyond America. Japanese government files, partially declassified in the 1990s, show that officials in Tokyo were aware of the immunity deals and actively cooperated in suppressing public knowledge of Unit 731. Victims who petitioned for recognition were denied, told their claims lacked sufficient evidence. Court cases brought by survivors in the 1990s were dismissed on procedural grounds, even as declassified US files confirmed the atrocities they described. The betrayal was twofold. Justice denied not only by the perpetrators, but by the victors, who had chosen expedience over accountability. The cost of this concealment was not only moral, but historical. By shielding Ishii and his colleagues, the Allies ensured that the full truth of Unit 731 remained obscured. The scale of the atrocities, the exact number of victims, and the full scope of Japan's biological warfare program remain uncertain even today, because the men who could have testified were never compelled to speak. Their silence was purchased, their crimes erased from the record, their knowledge repurposed in laboratories far from the eyes of those who had suffered. In the end, the files tell a story not of justice, but of compromise. While the Nuremberg trials declared that crimes against humanity would never be excused, Tokyo's forgotten biological weapons exchange proved otherwise. Atrocities were not punished, they were negotiated. The legacy of Unit 731 did not die in the ashes of Harbin. It lived on in classified annexes, in sealed laboratories, in the quiet careers of men who should have been condemned. And the voices of the dead, those who perished in plague-ridden villages, in frostbite chambers, on operating tables, were silenced not only by their executioners, but by the victors who chose secrecy over truth. Their absence lingers still, a shadow over the official story of World War II, a reminder that history too can be weaponized, and that the darkest truths are often the ones deliberately hidden from the world. In the labyrinth of archives and sealed vaults, these four shadows converge into a single chilling truth: that World War II was not only fought on battlefields, but also behind locked doors, in secret agreements, and in choices the public was never meant to see. The sanitized histories told of liberation, of victory, of noble sacrifice, but the classified files whisper of a different war. One where alliances were bought with silence, where scientists of death became architects of progress, where entire landscapes were burned not by enemies, but by their own, and where atrocities were not punished, but recycled into future weapons. The names of operations, Paperclip, Sever 12, Daggerfall, Cherry Blossoms, sound like codes from a forgotten machine. but each carried with it the weight of lives erased. These truths, scattered across OSS memoranda, NKVD reports, Air Ministry trials, and SCAP annexes, remind us that wars are not won cleanly. They are bartered, compromised, and rewritten. For every parade in liberated capitals, there was a file quietly locked away. For every courtroom drama at Nuremberg, there was a backroom negotiation that ensured some criminals walked free. The echoes of these decisions reverberate still, shaping the world we inherited from that conflict. And as each file is pried open, as each testimony long buried is heard again, we must ask, how many more shadows remain sealed? How many more truths are yet entombed in archives marked restricted, waiting for the day when their silence finally cracks? Until then, the war is not truly over. Its ghosts remain,